Go ahead and welcome our panel to the stage, and then I will briefly introduce them and then let them dive into the discussion. So, higher ed needs more cowboys. Let's welcome.
With a few more cowboys, be a lot less outlaws. With a few more amens, be a lot less bad calls. With a few more yes ma'ams and a lot less yes men, this world would be a better place to live in. With a few more cowboys.
Rajshree, good to see you. Bob, welcome.
Hey there.
Did you have your sniffle cut?
I did. I love that.
Okay, let me briefly introduce our panelists. Of course, all the bios of all of our speakers, their full bios are in the program, so I encourage you to take a look at those. Down here on the end, we have Brent Chrite, who is the Dean of the Daniels College of Business at the University of Denver. So great to have you with us, Dean Chrite. We have, next to Dean Chrite, we have Rajshree Agarwal. She is the director of the Ed Snyder Center for Enterprise and Markets at the University of Maryland. We became friends with Rajshree when we did the Campus Liberty Tour with Nigel Farage and Vicente Fox back in April. The University of Maryland was one of the stops on our Campus Liberty Tour. You're going to be hearing a little bit more about that later. But what a tremendous relationship we now have with the University of Maryland and with Rajshree and her fantastic team. So welcome, Rajshree. Here we have Bob Pasnau from right here in Colorado. Bob is the director for the Center of Western Civilization, Thought, and Policy at CU Boulder. I'm very proud to be on their advisory board. And also when we did the Campus Liberty Tour, Bob's Western Civ Center stepped up with a very generous contribution to help us fund the Campus Liberty Tour. And we did one of the debates in CU Boulder. So welcome, Bob, and thank you. And we have our panel moderator. Many of you already know her quite well. Jillian Melchior, grew up in Wyoming, graduate of Hillsdale College, was our second Tony Blankley Fellow, has gone on to join the Wall Street Journal as an editorial page writer. We couldn't be more proud of Jillian and the work she does. So now I'm going to turn it over to Jillian and our great panel.
Great. Well, Jennifer gave such a great introduction, but I think the first thing that you need to know about these panelists is that they are all cowboys. You know, when University of Wyoming was going through this controversy, one of the things that they were saying is that Cowboys is actually inclusive. It's that cowboy spirit, the independence, the willingness to think freely, and also the inclination to take on some adventure. These three are all a bit of adventurers. Rajshree, I know, went to school in India and was actually the girl on the motorcycle. That was her reputation. You'd be honking your horn trying to get people to get out of the way, and she'd come tearing by on her motorcycle, and people would just bail. And then in addition to that...
Horsepower, you know, what can you say?
Robert actually just got back from gallivanting all over the world. He's been in Beijing, in Indonesia, in Australia, New Zealand, and he is suffering through jet lag like a true cowboy. And,
is that a cowboy thing?
I think it's a cowboy thing, long hours. And then Brent has also done really incredible things. I think the most interesting thing I found out about him is that he went to Afghanistan, met with people high up in government, but also with representatives from the Taliban to discuss women in education and how to get them a business education. So you've got a fine panel here of independent thinkers. But I wanted to start out by getting you three to tell some tales from the trenches in your own higher ed adventure. So let's just start, Brent, with one of the controversies or one of the events that's happened on your campus in the last year, and talking a little bit about how administrators responded to it and whether they did the right thing.
Yeah, thanks very much. First of all, I'm from Detroit, and so I appreciate being referred to as a cowboy. That's a first. But I guess being in Colorado, I'll get used to that. Really delighted to be here. So, I've been reflecting on this question. Jillian graciously sort of shared with us some thoughts that we ought to consider. And while it is, in fact, difficult for me to come up with some sort of discrete examples on the University of Denver's campus and the Daniels College of Business, look, there is no question that there is there is an environment that is suboptimal for the kind of growth and opportunity and the pursuit of purpose that we're situated to be. But so I don't know if I have a discrete set of issues, but there is a sort of continuous refrain that I am very conscious about. I reflect back on the most recent presidential election. And look, as a dean of a business school, we've sort of always sort of been on our own island. We're free market folks, we're capitalists and proud of it, and that is not necessarily the ethos of some of my colleagues. But there was a sort of collective angst, and I refer to it euphemistically as this sort of intellectual sort of gnashing of teeth at the election. And some of my dean colleagues, most of my dean colleagues, held colloquia and forums and roundtables as to how we ought to prepare our students for this new awful world after 2018. And what I was taken aback by was the fact that for us at the business school, it was a non-issue. The electorate had spoken. We maintained the same faith and confidence in the vitality of the economy as we did before. And so we chose to not engage, intentionally not engage. In fact, I would have been horrified have any of my faculty or students expected us to engage. As much as I appreciate and respect many of my colleagues on campus, I caught a little flack for that. It was determined as I was indifferent, I was insensitive, and I think we've since dealt with that. But that is to some degree the sort of culture in which we're trying to exist in. And I thank goodness for me that I'm in a business school, so I can sort of hide behind markets and free thought and the role of capitalism and not have to worry about that. So that's a broad sort of example of the kind of conditions and factors that we're dealing with. In fairness, it's a wonderful institution, and that was an exception. But it does provide a forbearance to the kinds of things that we're trying to struggle with.
Yeah, so I would like to hear from you because you're from Boulder. It's kind of the epicenter of progressivism in Colorado. So I'm sure you've got an interesting story.
It's hard to know where to begin, really. I mean, you have to understand that around the country there are hundreds and hundreds of these incidents. We had Peter Wood from the National Association of Scholars visit our center last fall, and he keeps track of these things, and he'll send you the database if you want to see it. And every week there are new incidents. So he's got a database of hundreds and hundreds of them. And occasionally you'll get conservatives shouting down a liberal speaker, but as you might imagine, the overwhelming number of the cases are liberal students trying to stop a conservative from speaking. And we've been fortunate in the last few years that we haven't had any successful incidents of that kind on campus. We did have Charles Murray come out and give a talk last year, and I got the chance to talk to him about this, and he said virtually everywhere he goes, and he gives talks pretty much nonstop around the country, pretty much everywhere he goes, there's some kind of incident of this sort where it's difficult for him to speak, people try to shout him down. You're probably familiar with the worst sorts of cases, people throwing things at him, putting him in physical danger as well as the people he's with. As I say, we were fortunate not to have that happen on our campus, and I think I've got to give the administration some credit for this. I think they've been working very hard to sort of not let Boulder's liberal reputation set the tone for what goes on the campus, and I think they've done a pretty good job at that. I think it's also, it's mattered that we sponsor a lot of conservatives on campus. Every week we've got somebody coming into town giving a talk during the school year, and it makes a difference. I think we've sort of set the tone there, that this is just normal. And so when Murray came through, actually, there were no incidents. There was a diverse audience that came and listened to him. People people asked him hard questions, but people were respectful. And it made me kind of hopeful that there can be that kind of change of tone on college campuses. But we've got a long way to go, for sure.
So there has been a change of tone. Rajshree, I know when we were talking on the phone, you mentioned that you've noticed a difference since Trump got elected. Can you talk a little bit about
Well, let me
okay,
actually get to the first example of an actual instance on campus that is in some ways representative of the world that we live in today. So commencement 2017, big event, proud parents, super diligent undergraduates that are about to graduate. The undergraduate student speaker is Yang Shuping, a student from China who started her commencement speech very much talking about freedom. And in a very, very inspirational speech, she said, "The moment I stepped into the United States and I inhaled and exhaled the fresh air, I felt free." What she was connecting there was the pollution in the air of China with the lack of freedom to talk. Immediately after her commencement speech, there was huge outrage. State-owned newspapers in China and social media instigators launched an entire campaign about how she was disloyal, dishonest, and exaggerating the conditions in China. Paradoxically, precisely to illustrate the issues that she's talking about, thousands and thousands of social media messages ostracizing her, releasing the home address of her parents. This kid, in fear, retracted her statement and apologized. We were asked at the University of Maryland to do the same. President Lowe and all of us who stand for freedom were called to repudiate this particular instance because this did not bode well for relations. Now keep in mind that especially the Smith School of Business, Masters of Science professional program, has international students, particularly from China, as a very important source of our revenues. Because we as an institution refuse to give in to this pressure, we lost 40% of our admissions that year. The Smith School of Business is in the red this year because of all of our projected revenues are not available. This has actually caused a lot of internal turmoil. In fact, what I was very surprised about is that a fellow professor who actually is for free markets in the Smith School of Business was extremely angry about us standing up for this so important principle because we were losing on the economics of it. And when I looked at him and I said, this is a no-brainer. If we don't stand for this, we don't have any business in being here. He said to me, well, when your summer support is at question, let me know. I said, let me know when I need to write you back that check. The larger issue here, why is this an issue that we should care about? There are two things that I want you to know about this instance. One is what Yang had to deal with, and that is the fear, both from social conformity, but also from political power being used to restrict her freedom of thought and, as a result, freedom of expression. But this is not an issue of just China. This actually haunts us in the United States today. This is an issue that's equally disturbing for us on both aspects. So social conformity relates to the spiral of silence that each and every one of us feel. When we're having these hallway conversations with our colleagues about real consequences of standing up for freedom in terms of economic fallout, one needs to be able to stand up and say that and not feel like, well, do I really want to get into this nasty conversation and an argument when we're supposed to be having fun over a drink? The other relates to political intervention. One of the things that I am very disturbed about is we don't have state-owned newspapers, but we do have an increasing phenomena that the administration is now retaliating and blacklisting some newspapers, some organizations, as being bad versus good. As a business person, as a private entity, not a problem. But when the state starts to worry about what should be appropriate, what shouldn't be, now we're getting into the realm of having to worry about our freedom of thought being addressed. And keep in mind, freedom is like oxygen to an entrepreneurial spirit. We let forth these future business leaders, these future civic citizens from our university. When they go forth, they become you, the entrepreneurs, the leaders who are fearless in terms of thinking about your ideas and not looking at others in terms of fearfulness about whether or not you should move forward with your creativity and energy. We stop that. We stop the enterprise that makes this country bloom. And that's what I worry about today.
So I think you bring up a really interesting point that one way or another, universities' decisions, particularly on free speech and free discourse, have financial consequences. I've seen the other side of this, where universities who cave to the demands of the most radical students on campus end up losing the support of donors, of fans, students who no longer want to go there. But Robert, you've had, I would expect, a bit different experience. Can you talk a little bit about what the support from the public, from donors, from alumni is when you create a healthy discourse and when you allow that free expression to take place on campus?
Yeah, I mean, I like to start by talking about the students, because I mean, for me, the real reason to do this is because there's 25,000 undergraduates on the University of Colorado campus, and although Boulder itself is of course a very liberal place, that's not necessarily reflected in the student body, and there are a lot of students on the Boulder campus that this program deeply matters to, and the opportunity to interact with a varied faculty and varied intellectuals coming through is deeply important too, and that's kind of why we do it. But it's easy to it is certainly easy to sell that story to people that want to support the university, and so we have had a fair amount of success, not as much as I'd like, but a fair amount of success in finding people that want to support our efforts, and that's great because it's bringing in support to the university that otherwise just wouldn't be there at all. People that wouldn't otherwise even contemplate supporting the University of Colorado Boulder are looking at us and saying, oh, they are doing something there that I think's worth supporting.
That's fantastic. So you talked about students having a real hunger for that. Brent, I'd like to go to you with this question. So I was looking through the statistics on student trauma, and the statistics vary, but basically the bottom line is an unprecedented number of students have attempted suicide or contemplated suicide in the last year. Levels of anxiety on campus, according to these studies, are off the charts. Students are increasingly talking about trauma, and that's leading to discussions about everything from microaggressions on campus to whether we should have trigger warnings. So I'm interested, do you think that this generation of students is more traumatized than past ones? And if so, why?
That's a difficult question for me to answer. But the best response that I have is I am actually optimistic and excited and thrilled with the capacity, the compassion, the energy, the entrepreneurialism of today's students. They remind me what a blessing it is to be able to do what it is we do. I'm inspired by the young people here today, and I think whatever notions or discourse around trauma have much less to do with their psyches or their individual sort of ethos as it does with the institutional domains in which they are entering into. As an example, I think that we make it far too easy for students to come into a university environment and seek counsel and support and company with like-minded institutions. I think we perpetuate that. I think that we have a real obligation to provide meaningful, scalable platforms for the intentional thought and study of ideas that are contrary to the orthodox or the historical histories of most colleges and universities. What I fear is that we are anchoring down both ends of the extreme in that sense, and that's what's adding to the angst and the anxiety. And I have a message for the young people that are here today, that if and when they choose to go to a college or university, that they intentionally seek and even engage in ideas that are by definition contrary to your own. This is the world that we live in. This is how you best prepare yourself. And I think that colleges and universities have an obligation to present an environment and a set of platforms in ways that we haven't. And in that sense, if there's fault, I think it lies with us. And I appreciate this opportunity to talk about some of these things.
Robert, can students confront difficult or traumatizing ideas on campus? Can they discuss things that are potentially scary?
Let me give you an example from my own teaching experience. It'll maybe illustrate this sort of thing. I was teaching a freshman seminar last fall, a small class of I think around 15 students, and we were talking about the riots in Charlottesville. And one of the students said something in class that another student profoundly objected to, and I'm not sure the two students were actually understanding what each other was saying, but I mean, this is a normal sort of thing. Students disagree and so forth, and I thought, oh, this is fine, you know, this is what's supposed to happen in college. But afterwards, one of the students came to me, and she just said, I can't believe you let that happen. I cannot believe you let that student say the things that she was saying. And I just thought, wait, we were having a dialogue there. This was good, right? She said what she was thinking, and you responded, and you were both very articulate. I thought things were going well. But she was coming from a place where, no, the job of the professor is not to let things be said in the classroom that someone like me would find hurtful. And I felt like, at that moment, I just felt like I was out of my depth and needed to be retrained in how these things are done in, you know, the modern era. I don't think of myself as that old, but I felt very old at that moment. And like, wow, I don't know what I'm doing here. I mean, I eventually said, look, I think you two need to sit down and talk more. And they did sit down and talk more, but this student, for the rest of the semester, she was completely dissatisfied with the whole experience, and I just lost her because she was expecting me to protect her from her fellow students, and I just wasn't up for doing that.
So I regret to report that there is a training session for that. At universities, professors are increasingly being subjected to biased response teams where offended students can swoop in, tell administrators what hurt their feelings and how it was an act of sexism or racism or an attack on their own identity, and then expect administrators to respond to this. And I think we've seen this really expand. Rajshree, I want you to talk a little bit about how this relates to college affordability. and the growth of universities being focused on things other than educating?
So first of all, very telling in this example is the fact that our job as educators is really to only tell you the what, not anymore to tell you the how to think, and why it is important to think and to engage in this constructive dialogue. So based on this very faulty assumption that the student depicted in your classroom, one of the immediate fallouts is that we do need to be worried about the psychological and the emotional safety of our students. Moreover, you know, these are teenagers growing into adulthood. You know, there are going to be emotions, there's going to be sexuality out there, there's going to be all of these issues where there were boyfriends and girlfriends and all of these issues that you have to worry about. Well, that comes in the classroom too. And now they're traumatized because of those personal experiences. So I, as a professor, have to spend 15 to 20% of my time every year going through mandatory training on sexual misconduct, on biased response, on how to mediate. So I'm not just a professor of strategic management and entrepreneurship anymore. I have to be very well versed in becoming a lawyer. Those of you who are lawyers here know that, of course, it's so easy for me to get all of that information, right? I'm supposed to be a psychological counselor, right? And here's Adam Smith talking about division of labor and specialization, right? That's out the window. Because as a college professor, I need to be everything to these students. Now, this is not because the administrators are mandating it in the university. In fact, when I was leading the flagship 2020 commission at the University of Maryland, I really got in on exactly why administrative costs in the university is increasing. You may have heard of newspaper headlines, oh, administration bloat in college campuses, not as much being spent on university education and the primary responsibilities. Well, part of it is because administrative operating costs, now 15% of that is towards complying with federal regulations. We have to go through 200 different federal and state legislation pieces and report to 18 different regulatory agencies. All of this is huge compliance costs that we have to incur because all we want to do is prepare the students to be good civic citizens and future entrepreneurs and leaders. But the government is going to tell us how to do that based on the bureaucratic attitude that we need to safeguard against the bottom percent of people that may not be ethical, may not be compliant. But in doing so, we lose sight of the huge opportunity cost of the people that aren't unethical, that do want to go ahead and learn as opposed to feel safe and be safeguarded from ideas. I think this is an issue that we need to deal with as a society too.
Well, one of the more interesting trends, Brent, that I'm seeing is professors increasingly invoking the First Amendment after they have shut down a conversation. And I think like one example of this is at University of Nebraska. There's a student trying to set up a Turning Point USA chapter. A professor started yelling at her that she was the new Ku Klux Klan, calling her White Becky, really being aggressive, and brought the student to tears. So it became a big legislative issue. But the professor's defense to this was, it's my First Amendment too, I have the right to do that. So I'm curious what you think about that phenomenon and whether on campus students' First Amendment rights are pitted against faculty First Amendment rights, and whether those two things are actually in opposition.
You know, there's an example that came up, it's been in the press. Mark Short is a former legislative director for the Trump administration, and there's an entity that's actually its sole purpose is to provide perspective and insight on presidential leadership, and at the University of Virginia, one of the nation's great public research universities. And so Mark Short will join colleagues from Bush administration, from the Obama administration, as an affiliate faculty member. And the university went apoplectic at this hire, not because this was a former policy leader, but because he was associated with the Trump administration and the impact that that would have on the discourse. I mean, so this is really crass. This is sort of the dumbing down of the intellectual vitality of colleges and universities. And this notion of professors using their First Amendment right to in any way mitigate free speech or to control the dialogue really says much more about their limited view of the world and the role that democracy and freedom play than it has to do with the students. Look, it has always been easy to mischaracterize people with different ideas. It's even natural and it's convenient. The problem now in a social media world, a post-digital world, is that it's becoming a contagion, and it is much more accessible to elevate one's biases. And I think, frankly, too many faculty members view their role as instilling their own sense of the world, as opposed to providing students with the capacities to think critically and thoughtfully as they develop their own sense of person. Again, these are emerging adults, and this is part of the sort of syllogism in the history of higher education that I think needs to be changed and can only be changed with intentionality and a level of courage associated with leadership that is maybe less difficult in public institutions than it is in private. After hearing from you, I'm glad I'm in a private school. I don't have to deal with all the federal bureaucracy. But this is just part of the evolution of where I think colleges and universities are at this point.
So Robert, I want to ask you another question about things that are portrayed on a university campus as intention. I see often students and faculty arguing that on one hand you have diversity, equity, and inclusion, and that the enemy of that is free speech and free discourse. Your university seems to have reconciled these things pretty well. Can you talk a little bit about?
It's an ongoing battle. I'm not declaring victory yet, but
Sure, but can you talk a little bit about why people perceive those things as a tension and what you're doing to kind of bring that into check?
So I just think the left has got this stuff wrong right now, and but it's kind of their problem more than it's your all problem. I think, I mean, when they go out and, and the causes of ridding the world of racism and sexism and so forth, when they go out and shout down speakers and deprive people of the opportunity to express their views on a campus, all they're doing is harming themselves. And that's just, it's so obvious, I think, to any kind of outside observer. You don't have to be a devotee of Fox News or whatever to see that this is not doing those folk any good at all. And so they've got a problem, and it means that the left has a problem. It means that universities have a problem as well, because this sort of thing, it's not being just associated with a small group of students, it's being associated with universities in general. And so something needs to be done about it, and there has to be some way of kind of getting it through the minds of young people that, great, you want to fight racism and sexism, we all want to fight against these things, but the way to do it is not to shut down people's right to speak. That is simply counterproductive. I think somehow that message has to get across to people, and right now it's just not, and these folk are going about things in ways that are extremely counterproductive and damaging to these institutions.
Yeah, this is frustrating to me because I always think the marginalized have the most to gain from an absolutist perspective on free speech. But I wanted to ask all three of you this question, actually. One trend that I'm seeing is that I call it the intersectionalization of everything. It's things that have nothing to do with gender, with sexism, with racism, with all of these isms kind of infiltrating the hard sciences. So I'll give you an example. When Evergreen had its big controversy. The professors were actually being asked to justify their college courses and how it would serve social justice causes. And one of the professors there was saying, look, I teach biology. Like, I can't really do this in a justification. The science and its merit speaks for itself. But are you seeing this obsession with victimhood and victim identity creeping into business and into other disciplines where perhaps it doesn't belong?
So I was at a panel facing young, about to graduate undergraduate students, and there was a free question and answer period. And a very smart woman, a young lady, who had actually created quite a bit of a positive impression on me during our one-on-one conversations, stood up and asked me a question. I was, I think, the only woman on the panel. She says, what advice would you give me as a woman about to start her career? And I didn't even think about what I was saying when I was, and I just responded right off the bat. I said, don't think about yourself as a woman. Don't think of your gender. Focus on your abilities. You know what was what was heartening to me is that all of the undergraduates in that room applauded that response just like you did. That made me feel really, really good about the future generation. That we hear a lot about these intersectionality and victimhood and so on, and for sure, I worry a lot about how much this is coloring their own ability to think of themselves as leaders. If I think of myself as a victim, I am not going to think of myself as the brave person that's out there charting my own course, right? And so one of the things that's very important out here is to make sure that these things about what your gender, your sex, your sexual orientation, all of these really ought to be irrelevant. And of course, I happen to be an immigrant. I happen to be brown and a woman who's saying that because I've lived that life. And I am so happy to be in the United States, being able to do exactly these things because I refuse to let my color and my gender to be an issue in my own mind first and foremost, let alone what others might say to me.
But Brent, is this an increasing problem? Do you feel pressure to focus I guess your classes on these topics? Can you talk a little bit about where this is coming from? Is it the students? Is it administrators? And how intense is that pressure?
Yeah, there is more pressure. Look, I'm from Detroit. I'm a product of Detroit Public Schools. I was raised by a single mother there. I understand the challenges of folks of color. I mean, I get it. But it is difficult for me to facilitate or accommodate what I refer to as how we fetishize race and gender and this. I don't want to be disdainful about notions of victimization. I mean, I work in the most opaque, distorted, barely monetized countries in the world, and I understand what it means to be marginalized. And yet, if you think about one of the greatest gifts that this country has given to the world, it's the greatest gift. It's free market capitalism. And if you look at the antecedent factors and conditions associated with free market capitalism and entrepreneurial dynamism, it is the very things that we're talking about up here, that this has been and remains a merit-based society, and that ought to be the focus. There is a lot of pressure from certain segments of alumni communities, some donors, to focus on accommodating and to affecting curriculum so that it is inclusive. I mean, honestly, I don't know how you make an accounting curriculum inclusive. I mean, when it comes to teaching the time value of money, like if you're from the inner city of Oakland or Denver, I mean, it's the same set of skills, and I am deeply troubled by this. And I will say, I mean, they use a pretty homogeneous place. The business school it's a very white place. So here I am, this black dude from Detroit is the dean, and I have no interest in engaging in this conversation. It's a delicate balance to maintain with some of my colleagues. But the reality is that our success is going to be based on our capacity to enable young people to migrate through the on-ramp to the 21st century economy. And that has nothing to do with gender, race, orientation, sexuality, or whatever. And so our view is, look, that's what we're focusing on. And the rest of the, I was going to say rhetoric, that's disdainful. The rest of the conversation, I will let the university deal with. And we focus on preparing students for a global and connected private market. In the business school, that works. In the rest of the university, it's a little more volatile, again, which is why I appreciate being in a business school.
Please step in.
I want to push back just a bit against the question, because race and sex matter in this country, and as much as we might wish they didn't and that everyone was just blind to these things, they matter. And so whether you leave college and go into the business world or medicine or law, you've got to know how to cope with this stuff. And I think these issues are too important to leave to the gender studies department. I don't think we in a university, I don't think we want to do that. So, I teach in philosophy where you can talk about anything. But if I were teaching in a business school, I would think there ought to be somebody in the business school talking about this stuff, because I think a well-educated person in today's society does need to understand these issues and be aware of them and be sensitive to them. I think that stuff is important.
Well, actually, can you elaborate on that a little?
Yeah. I don't think that my response was that we shouldn't talk about it at all. In fact, I think we do need to talk about it. And I completely agree with you that these are issues we bring up. But the way we address them is very different than the way the gender studies professors are addressing it. And so we are giving our students a very different perspective. And in the Snyder Center, that's actually interdisciplinary. Even though it's in the business school, we have philosophers, we have historians, we have political scientists, we've got, you name it, they're there. And we're having these conversations. And look, this is not to deny the fact that there may very well be a socioeconomic factors that correlate with gender, that correlate with race, that do cause some people to start at a lower level in their quest of upward mobility than others. But the focus ought to be on upward mobility, not on the levels or equalizing the levels, if you will, because the only way you can equalize levels is to bring the people that are higher down.
Yeah, that's a great point. And the last thing I want to do is ever be sort of insensitive to notions of otherness and race, and I obviously deeply and personally understand that. The reality is, from a business school perspective, is that these notions of inclusivity and diversity are, in fact, in today's environment, an economic imperative. I sit on corporate boards and not-for-profit boards, and of course this is important. But I think, as you're saying, I think it's futile to put those issues in terms of our otherness front and center and make those the start of the dialogue. That's the problem. And if we can focus on performance and honing and building skills and enabling students to recognize high context environments and what it means to associate with teams and ideas and individuals that are different from your own, then we're doing our job. But I can't have a dialogue about how, you got a poor start in life, and therefore we're going to have a different set of standards for you, and that is what we choose to try to embrace.
So on that, I've actually got a question from the audience, and I think this is coming in the context of the Harvard discrimination case, where the university was actually looking at Asian applicants, giving them lower marks on things like personality, on their ability to relate to people. in the name of inclusivity. So somebody in our audience asks what the correct way is to address diversity issues at expensive and private universities, particularly when people are starting out marginalized. Is it through scholarships? Is it through affirmative action? Are there other alternatives?
I don't think affirmative action solved anything. If anything, it created more of an us versus them mentality. And it talked about, it in fact institutionalized exactly the issues that we've identified as problems. I do think the issue is very serious and needs to be dealt with. And in fact, that's one of the reasons why I believe that especially talking about enterprise and markets is the right solution to exactly these problems. So inclusivity is different from diversity. Diversity is just that we're different. The differences don't matter unless and until you talk about how does this relate to the value proposition, if you will, right? So the fact that I'm different from you is really not an issue unless those differences are really critical to whatever it is that we're trying to solve together and create solutions on problems around, right? So the larger issue for me is not about diversity per se. We're all different. If not for race or color or whatever, it could be about the fact that, you know what, I would have loved to have played volleyball. I'm 5'4". Can't do it. Guess what, right? So the larger point out here is there are all kinds of differences, but if I focus on my inability to do sports and then forget about the fact that I am a nerd and I love being a nerd and I love reading, right? So I can choose that profession. So if we talk about differences as it relates to division of labor and each of us optimizing our aspirations and our abilities, that's the way to go. But that's what free markets enable us to do.
Well, moving on a little bit, so I think at universities we're seeing administration certainly acting with an institutional bias toward progressive ideas. Someone in our audience wanted to ask about how this is playing out in the real world, particularly as graduates are going on in Silicon Valley, when you have Google, when you have Facebook being the arbiter of what is hate speech or what is bias. I guess the question for you guys is, do you think that the students that are coming out of this environment are going to become more oppressive, or in which ways are you encouraged to see them promoting American freedom?
I think colleges and universities have an obligation to do more, to be better, to create the kind of experiences and the kind of environment that will enable the level of discourse and civility that we want. I mean, look, if you come to, and I said this before, if you come to a university campus and you surround yourself with like-minded people, and if you're on the left, that means the majority of faculty, generally speaking. That probably means most of the students. And we don't, again, with intentionality and consciousness, create environments in which civil discourse, and I don't mean idiocy and incendiary, hateful diatribes and speech, but meaningful, intellectually rich discourse is part of the institution's DNA, then I think we will see more of this, because that's what we're developing and training, and so we've got some work to do in that sense.
So building off of that and talking about how we're preparing the future citizens and leaders for tomorrow, I think that in academia, I find that we often conflate two very important concepts. And our students, as a result, go out in the world confused about these concepts. So there are two pillars that we hold very strong in academia, particularly those of us who do think of academia as marketplace for ideas. One is what we've been talking about all along, and that is academic freedom. My freedom to not just teach, but now coming into the universities as creators of new knowledge, my ability to pursue those research questions that I believe are important to solve. But the related concept and a very important pillar in academia is that of academic integrity. This relates to the concept of the fact that I owe it to myself and to the canons of knowledge to follow science, as in the quest for truth, to be objective. What often happens in this left versus right dialogue that we have is that even among faculty, I, for instance, because I'm the director of the Snyder Center and I've come out now, am increasingly, I was never the same research that I did for the last 20 years, I was not questioned. Now all of a sudden, I'm being questioned about whether the Snyder Center and Rajshree Agarwal is producing biased research, being bought out by the Koch Foundation, right? Notice the difference here. That is an assault on my integrity, not on my freedom. What they're saying is that my integrity is for sale to the highest bidder. And that is not true. But I think we need to not only distinguish this distinction, right? So I have a First Amendment right to say whatever I want to, but that doesn't make me right. There's a difference between fact and opinion. And we in academia care about facts and objective truth. So to the extent that we obfuscate this difference, our students also don't think about that difference. And so as a result, they don't know how to say this is fact, this is opinion, fake news, not real news. How do I give credence to credibility and reputation signals? Nor do they think about emotions versus thought as being any different. Hence this thought about, oh, I need to feel safe emotionally as opposed to safely engaging in a diversity of ideas. So I do think that these are issues that we ourselves in academia, unfortunately, have not addressed, and as a result, we let these students go with the same confusion in their own mind.
So we've got about 5 minutes left, but I was struck on the phone talking to you guys preparing for this panel. When I'm looking at higher ed, reading the headlines every day, I don't see a lot to be optimistic about. But you guys were really optimistic about it. You saw a lot of positivity. So I'd like you to share with our audience where the good is in higher education and talk a little bit about how that is being overwhelmed by some of these more negative trends on campus.
Well, one thing I might say, starting with something that concerns me, some of you may have seen a survey that was done a year or so ago of conservatives who 58% of whom thought that universities are a negative influence on the country. Which means that, no doubt many of you are inclined to think, yeah, universities are a negative influence on the country. And that's very scary and suggests that those of us in academia are doing something very wrong, because that's a crazy thing to think. I mean, in as much as wow, I mean, how can that be right, that these great institutions are on balance a negative force for this country? I mean, this is one of the great glories of this country, is its universities. If you were to make a list of the 50 greatest universities on the planet, there might be 5 or so from outside the United States, but a good 45 out of 50 would be American institutions. These are institutions that draw people from all over the world to this country to study, to work as scholars. And so if we're doing such a spectacularly bad job of sort of representing the sort of the diverse views of this country, we've got to do something different about it. And so that's very scary, and that's really one of the reasons I do the work I do on the Boulder campus, to try to make the university a more diverse kind of place. And so that's a problem that we've got to fix. And if we don't fix it, we're going to be doing a disservice to our students in the immediate present, but we're also going to damage these great institutions, and that would be about the worst thing that could happen to this country. So it's got to be fixed, and I guess I'm somewhat optimistic that we can do it, but I just think the stakes are great.
Let me address why there is this difference between perhaps external perception of universities versus our own internal optimism. Let me just take a second and step aside and relate a story to you. So I live in Ellicott City, Maryland. Ellicott City is actually quite big. But there is a certain section of Ellicott City, the historic Ellicott City area, that was flooded. All of a sudden, of course, and it hit world news. So I had friends all over the world calling me and saying, hey, are you okay? Did you get flooded? Right? Because all they could see about Ellicott City was the floods. They didn't see anything else that was going on, right? Similarly, you turn on the 5 o'clock news. What do you see? This shooting happened, this person was arrested, you know. News is about the out of the ordinary. A student studying for his exam or her exam hard, getting a B- is not news. That student choosing to walk out and be part of a protest is news. So what you end up seeing, because the news by definition is about what's out of the ordinary, is focusing from the external perspective on all of the things that are wrong in academia. Now, that's not to say that everything is rosy. In fact, the last hour, we've been talking about all of the issues that we're addressing. But if you were to take a look at your own business enterprises, right? Generally speaking, do you feel pretty optimistic about the way your business is going? Chances are you'll say yes. Does that mean there are no problems? No, that's not what you're saying. But the focus on the problems requires diligence. That doesn't necessarily mean, however, that we throw the baby out of the bathwater and that things are dreadfully wrong. I am very, very excited. I get up every morning with a spring in my step, waiting to go onto campus, meeting the most positive students that I get to meet, the most positive research scholars that I engage with. I love being on University of Maryland. President Lowe is an inspiration every day to me. So there are a lot of things that I love about my job, and I wouldn't trade it for the world.
Yeah, I too, Jillian, am very optimistic, mostly as a result of the quality of young people coming up, their integrity, their compassion, their generosity, their work ethic. But I'm also a little more confident in our sense of perceptions externally in business school, because in business schools, there's a market test as opposed to just sort of intellectual scholarship. And I prefer to be at this intersection of intellectual rigor and market relevance. And when you focus on those two in the right proportion, you have a better sort of dialogue and a better sense of understanding in terms of what your needs are. The overwhelming majority of our colleagues are exceptional and creative and committed people. Like every industry, we've got some challenges, as we just said, but I feel really, really confident in our ability to resolve them. And it's a privilege to do what it is that we do. So thanks for this opportunity.
Fantastic. Great. Well, thank you guys so much. Go Cowboys. And hope this was informative.